History, as we are taught in the sterile halls of modern academia, is a linear progression of events, a tidy sequence of cause and effect. We are led to believe that the maps in our textbooks are the final, objective truth of the world's geography. But what if I told you that a map is not a mirror of the world, but a weapon of the mind? A map does not merely show you where things are, it tells you what is allowed to exist. If you want to conquer a people, you take their land. If you want to conquer a civilization, you take their history. But if you want to erase a world entirely, you take their name off the map. In the vault, we don't look at what is there. We look at the hollow spaces where something used to be. For centuries, the largest landmass on this planet, a territory spanning from the icy reaches of the Arctic to the peaks of the Himalayas, and from the gates of Europe to the shores of the Pacific, was not called Russia, Siberia, or Central Asia. It was called Tartaria, Grand Tartary, the Great Tartary. This was not a nomadic wasteland. This was an empire with its own emperors, its own distinct flag, its own complex heraldry, and a network of cities that would rival the greatest capitals of Europe. Yet, by the mid-19th century, this name, a name that had stood for 1,000 years, simply vanished. It didn't just fade, it was surgically removed. Who held the scalpel? Who decided that the largest empire in human history should be turned into a footnote of uncivilized tribes? Today, we follow the ink. We look at the maps that weren't meant to survive the Great Revision. To understand the scale of the deception, we must first look at the world as it was understood by the greatest minds of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. These were the men who mapped the oceans, who calculated the stars, and who laid the foundations of modern science. Men like Abraham Ortelius, Gerardus Mercator, and Nicholas Sanson. In the 16th century, Abraham Ortelius published the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, the first modern atlas. In it, Tartaria is not a vague region, it is a sovereign powerhouse. It is divided into distinct provinces: Muscovite Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, and even Desert Tartary. Each region is meticulously mapped, with rivers, mountain ranges, and most importantly, thousands of cities. Think about that word, cities. History tells us that this region was inhabited by barbarian hordes and nomadic tribes living in tents. But the maps of the 1600s tell a different story. They show us a land dotted with the symbols of permanent, high-level civilization. We see cities like Kambalu, Chayan, and Quinsay metropolises described by travelers as centers of immense wealth, advanced technology, and spiritual wisdom. Even the Encyclopedia Britannica, in its first edition in 1771, stated clearly, Tartary, a vast country in the northern parts of Asia, bounded by Siberia on the north and west. This is called Great Tartary. The Tartars, who lie south of Muscovy and Siberia, are those of Astrakhan, Circassia, and Dagestan, situated northwest of the Caspian Sea. The Kalmuk Tartars, who lie between Siberia and the Caspian Sea. The Uzbek Tartars and Moguls, who lie north of Persia and India. And lastly, those of Tibet, who lie northwest of China. This was the official, globally recognized reality for hundreds of years. It was taught in universities. It was used by kings to negotiate treaties. It was the North that the world feared and respected. So, how does an empire of this magnitude, documented by every major cartographer for 3 centuries, suddenly become an administrative error? Let us take a journey through the provinces of this forgotten giant as they were depicted before the erasure. First, we have Independent Tartary. This was the heart of the empire, situated between the Caspian Sea and the borders of China. It was a land of ancient wisdom, connected to the legendary Silk Road, but possessing a technology that far surpassed the simple trade of spices. The maps show intricate canal systems and star forts that guarded the trade routes, geometric masterpieces of engineering that we are told were built much later by European colonialists. Then we have Chinese Tartary. In our current history, we are told that the Great Wall of China was built to keep out nomadic invaders. But if you look at the maps from the 1700s, you will notice something peculiar. The openings and the battlements of the Great Wall often face south. They were not built by the Chinese to keep the Tartarians out. They were built by the Tartarians to mark the boundary of their empire and keep the southern dynasties at bay. Finally, there is Muscovite Tartary. This is the area we now call Russia. But the maps clearly distinguish between Muscovy, the small region around Moscow, and the vast Tartary that lay to the east. They were two separate entities, often at war, often in uneasy alliance. As you trace these maps from the 1600s to the late 1700s, you see a consistent, stable landmass. You see a civilization that was not expanding or colonizing in the way the West was, but a civilization that was. It was the stable center of the world. And then we hit the 19th century pivot. The ink begins to change. The names begin to shift. The dragon flag is lowered, and the double-headed eagle of the Romanovs begins to be painted over the maps. It was a cartographic coup d'etat. The 19th century was the century of the Great Reset. It was the era when the modern world as we know it, our borders, our schools, our history books, was standardized. And in that standardization, there was no room for a rival global power like Tartaria. Between 1800 and 1850, we see a systematic cleansing of the maps. It started in the academic centers of London, Paris, and St. Petersburg. New geographical societies were formed. Their mission was not to discover the world, but to classify it according to the needs of the new empires. Suddenly, the independent Tartary became Turkestan, Chinese Tartary became Manchuria, Muscovite Tartary was swallowed by the Russian Empire. In less than 2 generations, the name that had dominated the Asian landmass for a millennium was relegated to a vague historical term used by early travelers. Why? Because if Tartaria existed, then the history of the Russian Empire, the history of the British in India, and the history of the expansion of the United States were all lies. If Tartaria was a high-tech civilization with free energy and global architecture, then our modern industrial revolution was just a slow, clunky recovery of lost knowledge. Who gave the order? We see the fingerprints of the Big Three: the British Empire, the Russian Romanovs, and the Qing dynasty. They were the scavengers who tore apart the corpse of the Tartarian Empire after it was weakened by the Great Mud Flood. They rewrote the maps to claim they had discovered or civilized lands that had actually been more advanced than their own just a few decades prior. When we think of the history of the United States, we are taught a very specific, very narrow story. We are told of the manifest destiny of pioneers in covered wagons moving into a wild, untamed wilderness. We are told that the West was a blank canvas, waiting for the light of civilization to be brought from the East. But the maps tell a different story. If you look at the cartography of the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries, the Pacific Northwest and the region we now call Alaska were not blank. They were often labeled as part of the Tartarian sphere of influence. In many maps from the 1700s, the Bering Strait is not a clear division. Instead, we see a landmass that nearly touches, or in some cases, is connected by a series of islands labeled with Tartarian names. We see the Kingdom of Anian, a legendary region that maps of the time placed exactly where Alaska and British Columbia stand today. Even more disturbing is the prevalence of California as an island maps. For over 100 years, the most sophisticated mapmakers in the world depicted California as a massive island separated from the mainland by a wide strait. Historians call this a cartographic error. But how do hundreds of independent mapmakers over a century all make the exact same error? The answer lies in the mud flood and the Great Reset. These maps weren't wrong. The geography changed. A massive geological event, a flood of mud and water, reshaped the coastline, filled in the straits, and buried the Tartarian outposts that existed along the American West Coast. When the pioneers arrived in the mid-1800s, they weren't settling a wilderness. They were scavengers, moving into the half-buried ruins of a civilization that had been there for thousands of years. They found the cities, they found the star forts, and then they commissioned the mapmakers to update the records to reflect their new ownership. A vague geographical region does not have a flag. A nomadic tribe does not have a sophisticated system of heraldry that is recognized by every maritime power on Earth. If you go to the maritime archives and look at the flag books from the late 1700s, books used by sailors to identify the nationality of ships at sea, you will find the flag of the Emperor of Tartary. It is a striking image, a black dragon, or sometimes a griffin on a bright yellow field. In some versions, it is an owl. Why an owl? In the ancient world, the owl represented wisdom, the ability to see in the dark, and a connection to the hidden forces of nature. The dragon represented the mastery of the earth and the heavens. These were the symbols of a high-tech, high-wisdom civilization. These flags appear in the official flag charts of the United States, Great Britain, and France as late as the 1850s. Think about that. While the history books claim Tartaria was long gone or never existed, the navies of the world were still being taught to recognize their colors on the high seas. Then, suddenly, the dragon disappears. In the flag books of the 1880s, the yellow flag is gone. It is replaced by the tricolor of the Russian Empire, or the dragon of the Qing dynasty, a different dragon, one that had been domesticated and brought under the control of the new global order. The owl was silenced, the dragon was slain, and the maps were cleared of the symbols that proved the North was once the center of global sovereignty. To understand the vanishing maps, you must understand the mud flood. Maps are not just political, they are topographical. They record the shape of the land. Between 1840 and 1850, a catastrophe occurred that literally changed the face of the Earth. Whether it was a plasma discharge, a pole shift, or a localized liquefaction of the soil, the result was the same. Millions of tons of mud and sediment were deposited across the northern hemisphere. The Tartarian cities, built with heavy stone and sophisticated plumbing, were partially submerged. The magnificent star forts that once acted as energy resonators were filled with silt, turning them from machines into historical ruins. The mapmakers of the mid-19th century were given a dual task. First, they had to record the new geography, the filled-in straits, the new coastlines, the buried valleys. Second, they had to provide a cover story for the ruins. This is why we see the sudden rise of archaeology in the 1850s. It wasn't about discovery, it was about classification. The new empires, the British, the Russians, the Americans, sent out surveyors to map the new world that had emerged from the mud. They found the Tartarian palaces and labeled them Roman ruins or Greek revivals. They found the buried cities and called them newly established colonies. The maps had to change because the old maps were too accurate. They showed a world that no longer existed, and they showed cities that the new controllers wanted to claim as their own innovations. The ink was barely dry on the new maps before the old ones were gathered up and burned. If you wanted to find the real maps today, where would you go? You would go to the great repositories of human knowledge, the Library of Congress, the British Library, the Vatican Archives, or the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. And what do we find in the history of these institutions? Fire. In 1851, the Library of Congress suffered a mysterious fire that destroyed 2/3 of its collection, including the most detailed early maps of North America. In the late 1800s, dozens of great fires swept through the administrative centers of the world: Chicago, Toronto, Moscow, London. These were not accidents. These were controlled erasures. When a city is burned, the physical buildings are gone, but more importantly, the records are gone. The property deeds, the genealogical records, and the original unredacted maps. The vanishing maps were not just lost, they were hunted down. The agents of the New World Order, the men in top hats who curated the fairs, spent decades traveling the globe, buying up old family atlases, donating private collections to state libraries, and then ensuring those libraries accidentally burned. What we have left today are the approved versions, the maps that were sanitized for public consumption. But in the vault, we know that if you look closely at the scans of 19th century maps, you can still see the ghost lines of the Dragon Empire underneath the new ink. When we look at the history of Southeast Asia, we are told a story of colonial discovery. We are told that the French, the British, and the Dutch arrived in a land of primitive kingdoms and jungle-choked ruins. But when we open the vault and look at the maps of the 17th and 18th centuries, the maps of Cochinchina, Tonkin, and Champa, we see something that contradicts the primitive narrative. On the maps of missionary explorers like Alexandre de Rhodes or the Dutch cartographers of the VOC, we see cities marked with the same high-level fortification symbols as those in Europe. We see citadels with perfect geometric precision. Look at the maps of Old Saigon, Gyading, or Hue. They feature the unmistakable silhouette of the Star Fort. The official history says these were built in the Vauban style by French engineers hired by local kings in the late 1700s. But look at the logistics. To build a massive, mathematically perfect stone and brick star fort in the middle of a tropical jungle, using only manual labor and elephant transport in a matter of years? It is the same lie we see in Chicago. These French engineers were not builders, they were surveyors. They were mapping a pre-existing Tartarian infrastructure that spanned the entire globe. The star forts of Vietnam were part of a coastal defense and energy network that had been there for centuries. The maps were rewritten to credit the European genius for these structures, effectively stripping the local population of their true architectural heritage and making them feel indebted to their colonial masters for the very walls they had inherited. In the modern world, a map is a tool for navigation or a record of ownership. But in the Tartarian world, a map was a technical schematic. If you take a map of the star forts, the cathedrals, and the obelisks of the pre-1850 world and overlay them, you don't see random placement. You see a global grid. These structures were positioned on ley lines, the magnetic meridians of the Earth. The vanishing maps were once encoded with this information. They didn't just show where a city was, they showed the frequency of that city. The star forts were the nodes, the cathedrals were the amplifiers, and the obelisks were the antennas. Together, they created a wireless energy system that provided light, heat, and communication to the entire empire. When the Great Reset occurred and the mud flood buried the lower levels of these machines, the new controllers had to hide the grid. They couldn't have the survivors knowing that the Earth itself was a battery. So they commissioned political maps. They drew lines called borders to break up the grid. They renamed the power stations forts and churches. They turned a global circuit board into a collection of warring nations. The maps were sanitized of their energetic significance, leaving us with a world that is geographically accurate, but spiritually and technically hollow. The vanishing maps were not limited to the Earth. The most profound erasure occurred in the maps of the stars. If you look at the celestial atlases of the 1600s, the zodiac and the constellations are depicted with a level of complexity and otherworldliness that we no longer see. They show stars that have since disappeared and planets with rings and moons that wouldn't be discovered by modern telescopes for another 200 years. There is a theory in the vault that the Great Reset was not just a terrestrial event, but a cosmic one. Whether it was a change in the Earth's tilt, a shift in the magnetic poles, or a literal restarting of the firmament, the sky we see today may not be the sky the Tartarians saw. After 1850, the star maps were unified and simplified. The ancient myths associated with the constellations were rewritten to be Greek and Roman, obscuring the original Tartarian celestial science. They changed our clock. They changed our calendar. By changing the maps of the stars, they disconnected humanity from the true cycles of time and the energy of the cosmos. We were left blind in a world that had once been perfectly aligned with the heavens. One of the most effective tools of the cartographic lie is the blank space. In the maps of the late 19th century, we see vast areas labeled as Terra Incognita, land unknown. These were mostly in the American West, Central Africa, Australia, and the Arctic. Historians tell us these areas were unexplored, but if we look at the maps from 100 years earlier, those same areas were completely filled in. They were full of cities, rivers, and kingdoms. How can a land be known in 1750 and unknown in 1880? The answer is the Great Sanitization. When the new controllers took over, they found Tartarian cities that were too advanced or too difficult to explain away. So, instead of trying to rename them, they simply erased them from the map. They declared the region unexplored or wilderness. This gave them time to send in the explorers, who were actually military cleanup crews. These crews would demolish the ruins, re-educate the survivors, or prepare the site for a new settlement. Once the site was sanitized, the map makers would discover it and give it a new name. The blank spaces were not gaps in knowledge, they were gaps in the narrative, waiting for the lie to be polished. To understand how the maps of Tartaria vanished, we must understand the chronological coup. Maps are dated, they have a year of production. But if you look at maps from the $I-500s, $I-600s, or $I-700, and I use that notation intentionally, you will see something that modern historians dismiss as a stylistic quirk. On thousands of coins, monuments, and maps produced before the mid-19th century, the first digit of the year is not a 1, it is a lowercase, $I or a $J. In the vault, we interpret this as a variable. The $I stands for Jesus Jesus, or Ino in the year of. The date $I-550 was not 1550. It was the year 550 since the event of Jesus. When the Great Reset occurred in the 1800s, the controllers did something ingenious. They replaced the $I and $J with the number $1. In a single stroke of the pen, they added 1,000 years of phantom time to our history. They took a civilization that had been flourishing just a few hundred years ago and pushed it back into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The maps had to be rewritten to accommodate this fake timeline. A map of Tartaria from the year $I-780 became 1,780. This allowed the controllers to claim that the Tartarian Empire had slowly declined over centuries, when, in reality, it was destroyed in a sudden cataclysm only a few generations before our great-grandparents were born. The maps were the primary tool for this chronological fraud. By changing the dates, they changed our perception of how long ago the old world actually existed. They made the truth feel ancient and mythical when it is actually still warm beneath the mud. Why was the International Meridian Conference of 1884 so important? Before this date, every nation, every empire, and every Tartarian remnant had its own prime meridian. There was no universal time. In 1884, the representatives of the New World powers met in Washington, D.C. to standardize the planet. They chose Greenwich, England, as the center of time and space. This was the final nail in the coffin for the Tartarian maps. By forcing the entire world to use a single coordinate system based on London, they made all previous maps obsolete. Any map that didn't align with the Greenwich meridian was labeled unscientific or inaccurate. This was the Great Synchronization. They didn't just change the maps, they changed the way we perceive our relationship to the sun and the stars. They turned the Earth into a grid, a cage of degrees and minutes that served the new maritime and financial empires. The Tartarian maps, which were based on a much more complex understanding of the Earth's magnetic fields and energy hubs, were gathered up and replaced with the standard map we see in every school today. It was a cartographic lobotomy. The vanishing maps didn't all burn. They were simply moved. In the depths of the Vatican's secret archives, in the temperature-controlled vaults of the Smithsonian, and in the private collections of the old money families in London and Zurich, the living maps still exist. These are the maps that show the truth. They show the extra lands beyond the Arctic and Antarctic circles regions that were once part of the Tartarian trade networks. They show the true topography of the Earth, including the vast tunnel systems that connect the continents. They show the star fort nodes that are still active and drawing energy from the ether. The global elite use these maps to navigate the real world, while they provide us with Google Maps, a digital simulation designed to keep us moving in circles within the approved borders. The living maps are the reason why flight paths in the southern hemisphere are so illogical. The living maps are the reason why no-fly zones exist over seemingly empty parts of the ocean. They know where the old power is. They know where the ruins of Grand Tartary are still functioning, and they will kill to ensure that those maps never reach the public eye. Because the moment we see a map that isn't a lie, we become free from the reset. We have traveled from the empty cities of the 19th century to the vanishing maps of the Tartarian Empire. We have seen how the ink was used to hide the blood, and how the blank spaces were used to hide the palaces. But the maps are just paper. The truth is in the Geichbrick, the Das stone, and the dirt soil beneath your feet. When you walk through your city today, don't look at the signs. Don't look at the official history plaques. Look at the foundations. Look at the windows buried in the mud. Look at the cathedrals that look like power stations. The maps were changed so you would feel like a settler in a world you actually own. They made you a guest in your own home. But as long as one person, one Thomas, continues to ask why, the map is not complete. The Tartarian Empire didn't disappear. It was just renamed. Its technology was just privatized. And its maps are just waiting for a new generation of explorers to draw them again. The vault is open. The choice is yours. Will you stay within the borders of the lie, or will you sail into the terra incognita?